So I am now recording, it looks like.
Lovely.
Welcome. So yeah, welcome everybody. This is week 3. We are practically a third of the way through the excitement of the spring term online fest. And it's also sort of a week to celebrate in that this is kind of the last pure, well, I mean, maybe in some ways, the last like pure coding week. So after this week, when most of the coding examples we're doing are still fairly abstract, it's just going to be teaching you these sort of basic fundamental things that you really need to know to sort of have a good basis of understanding how code can work. But then really from this point on, we're going to be starting to attach all the key things that you've learned thus far and start attaching them to making objects move and making your graphics appear for games and things like that probably will have a little bit more of a sort of a tactile reward, I think, to them. So that stuff will all be starting next week. We're going to start transitioning to do more and more of that. And so, yeah, I think that's kind of an exciting place to be. But we do have a bit more of the sort of coding basic stuff to get through just this week. And then also potentially a little bit more as time allows and as interest allows, maybe a little bit of starting to think about asset creation, how to make things, and how to start thinking about making things for games in the coming weeks. So we'll see if we get to that or not this time around. But the key things that we really want to cover in terms of code this week are two main topics. And so it's kind of easier because it's easier to focus in. It's two main things that we're really covering, but those two things are a little bit more advanced than what we've covered thus far. And they're also really powerful. So the things that you're going to find that you're going to be coming back to and using over and over again. And the names of these things are, one are arrays, and one is a for loop. And then as time allows, we'll maybe also, if people are hanging in, have a little bit of a time just as for a little bit of an advanced topic dealing with objects that we might talk about a little bit as well. And there isn't really an assignment based on that this week, but it's maybe more for those just to sort of point in the direction of what's to come, because you'll likely want to try and start using these ideas of JavaScript objects, which are basically containers for holding more complex information in one place as you move forward into the game development projects. And also those of you that are like, hey, all this stuff that's happening is going fine. I got a full grasp on it. Gives you a little bit of something more to chew on, so to speak. So yeah, that's really the goal. But also before we get started, just want to see if there's any big questions or things that we want to review on from the last week or last couple of weeks. So that would be great to sort of see if there are any key topics. So this last week, what were we covering? We covered a bunch of the random number stuff, conditionals, if-thens, and then other things that were sort of tied in with that, right? So Booleans, which were like true-false statements, comparators that come up in if-thens. So if a number is greater than, if it's less than, if it's equal to, if it's not equal to, those are some good ones. And then really starting to then use functions also in a way that started returning values. So you'd have a function that does something and then it spits out a value that gets returned to the rest of the code. Yeah. Okay, well, feel free to shout out if questions related to any of that are still lingering, or as we're moving forward, and we'll sort of address some of those along the way as well. So nice. So let me go ahead and start sharing my screen, I suppose, and we'll get started that way. And look at where we're at in the Moodle site and the stuff that's coming up for this week, and then we'll jump into some CodePen. So there we go. This should be our familiar Moodle page. So I have populated in, sorry for the scroll here, populated in our week 3 projects. So if you haven't taken a look at that, no worries, but it should be up there now. So again, there's a week 3 coding videos and tutorials. This has not been populated with anything other than that, just this replacing in there that sort of series of slides, the EMDA 203 code basics or code something, whatever slides that sort of have been following us along the whole way. But we'll get this video posted up there later today. And then really there's just 4 of these. Some of them are maybe a little bit more advanced, so not as many in number as the last week, but maybe a little bit more advanced in terms of the topics that are going to be in there. One just on arrays, one just on for loops, one that combines for loops and arrays, which is a really common thing, and then one that sort of combines that all together with functions, sort of makes sort of a powerhouse sort of final version there. So yeah, let's start talking about what these things are. The first thing that I want to talk about are arrays. And let me pull over this so it's a little bit easier to see. And arrays really are ways of storing multiple elements in an ordered fashion. And so an element can be anything. It just like thinking about like variables. When we were doing variables, so we'd have like a var name, and we'd say that var name equals, and I'll just put in David. So this is a variable, and it's holding something. There's a lot of different things that it can hold, right? It can hold numbers, it can hold strings, which is what this is. Eventually it can hold other more complex things. And so one of those complex things that it can start holding is an array, which is basically, in like a sort of layman's terms, it's basically like a list of other things. So it could be a list of numbers, it could be a list of strings, it could be a list of even more complex objects, so that eventually you could have an array that holds arrays within it. So you get sort of this, what's known as like a multi-dimensional array. But so if I wanted to, for example, if we wanted to have something called names instead of just name, we could store a whole bunch of names in an array. And the syntax that we use is using the square brackets, and then we have things separated, or elements separated by commas. So just like you would in a normal list. If it's going to be a string, you want all of your elements to still have quotations. So I could have David, comma, Miles, comma, Rad. I'm just sort of the top 3 people on my side panel here. So let's do for Chris. Oh, forgot something like this. There we go. And I'm going to put a semicolon at the end of our line here. So this is the basic structure of an array. So this tells it, so seeing it here starts telling you a little bit more about what it can be. So we can have this is an array of names. So basically, again, that shorthand of thinking of it like a list. So great. Let's do a couple other things before we start learning a little bit more about it. So I could have, remember, we could have a var num, and let's say our number was some random number, but I'm just going to type it in here and say it was 5. So a variable can hold a number, whether it's an integer or floating point. And you could have an array of numbers. So you could say numbers and call that an array. And here you would not use the quotation marks, but let's say our numbers are whatever they are. And something like that. Right now, these are just arbitrary numbers, but they might have some sort of a meaning or an order to them. And let's see, anything else? Any other types? Right now, that's probably enough. So now you can see 2 examples here of arrays, one that is holding a series of strings and one that is holding a series of numbers. So great, okay, so all that means is names contains all of this stuff. And if we were to print that, actually, let's sort of see what it does first, and then we'll start thinking about how can we access individual parts of that. But if we say document.write, and I'm not 100% sure what it's going to do here, names, what's going to happen? Oh, okay, it printed out the whole thing like that. Let's see if we do console.log of names and see if it's going to do us anything different. And for the console, remember, come down here, click on the console. Okay, great. That's kind of a little bit more what I was expecting to see, which is when you do it to the console, it shows you the whole array, and it shows you that they're bracketed in as a full array. When it printed it up here, it sort of split that out and just put out the elements, which is nice, but it's not as obvious that it is an array that's coming out. Okay, so now one of the most common things you're going to want to be able to do is to be able to find a particular element within an array. So it's like, great, I got this list, but I want to be able to access one element at a time. I want to be able to pull something out from that. So to do that, there's an address. So each element, which is what I've mentioned it here a couple times, each of these things in the list is called an element. So it's an element of an array, and they have an address. And the address is, in this case, in a simple array, it's just a number that indicates its index. So where is it located in that long list of things? And here, like a number of things in coding, you're going to start counting from 0. So element 0 is going to be the first element in an array. So if I come here and say let's see, I'm gonna do this as a 2-step thing here for a second. Current name as a var. I'm gonna hide my console because I don't need to be worrying about my syntax errors as they come up. There you go. So var current name equals or gets names, and I'm going to use the square brackets and say 0. So the number that I'm putting in there is a index that I'm calling back, and then I'm going to write it to my document.write current name semicolon. Aha, it showed up. Great. It says David. And so now if I put in 1 and wait for it to update, it does Miles. If I do 2, it does Rad. And so remember, so by 2, it's going 0, 1, 2. So I'll always count from 0, 1, 2, like that. Then we do 3, and we get Chris. 4 is Megan. 5, Jennifer. 6, undefined. Great. Okay, so that means that it's an element in the array that doesn't exist. So we have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The 6th one is undefined. It just does not, it hasn't been entered yet. So it comes back like that. Great, so we have an array and we have an index. Let's say we wanted to be able to add in another element to our array. So right now we have these 5 elements in here. There's a number of different ways that you can do this. You can overwrite something. So let's say David, I'm out of the game and and someone else is going to take my place. I can say names 0 gets something new, and it gets Otis, my dog. Now, if I print out current names gets name 0, we see Otis. Okay, so it went from this list that had David as defined as being in the 0 index. Then I overwrote it with Otis. So now if we were to do the full document.write on the names, we would see that it would put in the full list, and Otis is just that first member of it. Yeah, is that making sense so far? Cool, yeah. Yeah, it was a question about comments. And I think Yeah, I think comments have to be outside. Yeah, as Brad said there, I think comments have to be outside the scope of that. Yeah, there might be. I'm trying to think if I've ever seen comments like inside like of an object. They might be able to be inside of an object. I'm not 100% sure on that, but we'll see. But typically, when you're with the array like this, yeah, it's going to be at the end. So I could put in a comment afterwards and say, this is an array of names, as you would expect. Cool. So
the other thought I had in looking at Cody's question there on the comment on the chat is, you might be talking about creating an object literal, where instead of a number, you can refer to something by its name. So we can come back to that. I think that might maybe be what you're talking about. I can do that.
Yeah.
So, cool.
Yeah, because there's this close relationship between arrays and objects that looks pretty similar in a lot of ways, but there's just a couple differences. And so yeah, we'll start with arrays. We'll get to those objects a little bit later. Nice. So okay, so I wrote in here, overwrote something. Overwrit. Whatever it is, David with Otis, and that worked out. But if I were to then instead put in, we were getting that undefined thing on 6, right? So if instead I put in names 6 to be Otis, so that was 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So that would be a new element in our array. And now if I try and print that here, let's see if it works. Yeah, it does. So simply by calling the name of the array and then providing it with an index that doesn't exist yet, so this 6, and then assigning it a value with the equals, I'm able to then add in an additional element to my array. So that's one way to do that, which can be very useful, especially if you are doing something where you're keeping track sort of dynamically of how long your list is. So this means you need to know how many you have in there and what one is going to be the last one. And right now that's a pretty trivial thing, right? Because we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 elements. We can just visually count them, and we could do this. But there are some ways that some methods that are easier, that you don't have to keep track of things in quite this precise way. So another way to do that would be, and this is the way that I almost all the time add something to an existing array. And this is by doing names dot push and then give it another name. Let's see. Names dot push Casper. And now if I were to, let's write the whole thing again instead of just a single. And we'll write names. What's happening here? Someone catch my error? Is there an error in here? Why we're not getting?
Sorry.
So I should be able to get here this last one happening. So I've created an array. I have names.push.
Casper.
Pushing in, yeah, document.write names. And it should add it on there. Oh. Here it is.
I know what it is, David.
You got it?
Push is a function, so you can't do a thing. You have to do brackets and then.
Oh yeah, of course. Nice catch.
Nice.
Yeah. So, so this is yeah. So let me do it, and then I'll explain that as rad, caught it. So if yep. So there we go. Now writes in, awesome, got it. So exactly. So these dot things can be tricky sometimes with JavaScript. So you have something dot, in this case, push. Remember, we've had math.random. We had math.floor. There's a couple other examples of that we've seen, document.write. And actually, most all the cases we've encountered so far are functions, or as you call them, methods. So that means that it's going into this thing of names, and it's accessing a series of one of two things: either properties, which are sort of more static elements that are attached to that. So if you could think of like a character, and we'll do this later with an object, but a character might have certain properties, like they might have an age, they might have a strength, they might have a what else might they have? Like a class, or a geographic location, any number of things like that. But they also might have what we call methods, which are like functions that might be attached to them. So it might be like a spell that they have that does some particular thing, might be encapsulated in a function that it's going to do a series of things. And you might be able to call the function associated with that character. So in this case, we have arrays have some pre-built methods that are associated with them. Dealing with, a lot of them deal with like, so if you have your array and then you're going to add something to the end of it, which is push. If you're going to add something into the middle of it, it's like split. And there's some other ones like that. By far the most common one I ever end up using is push, but other ones come up. So to demarcate that it is a method or a function, rad is 100% right. We need the parentheses around it, so that it's saying, okay, here's the function. So the simple thing like that, math.random just needs those open close brackets to say, okay, we're calling back to get a random value. Here, I'll put in my word, my name in there, and it adds it to the end of the list. And if we do that again, it'll just add yet another name to the end of the list, even if it's the same name. Great, so that's some good ways to extend lists. And this can actually happen also, let me do it as a new thing down here, as an array that starts from scratch. So if we said, I'll just give us a new line here, document.write. And we're going to do var colors, and we're going to say that it is a new array. This is something I haven't done, but this is just defining that colors is a new variable, and that it's being assigned, that it's going to be a data type of an array. So it's going to be holding an array. So now I could come in sometime later in my code and say colors.push, parentheses, as we know we need, red. And now it's going to have red added to it. Document.write colors. And great, now I have added in one element to my array. It started out here. If I was doing this if my code was done right here, back to back, it's kind of silly. You would just write the word red into the array. But imagine that you have something where you're wanting to set up some space for something at the beginning of your code, beginning of your game, and then who knows later, when an object is destroyed or something like that, a creature is killed, then you're going to push a new object into the array sometime later in code. So this is when you'd want to be able to do that. So I can then start adding in more and more and more and more. Right now, it's just going to be a bunch of the same. And you see that when it prints it out, it auto separates them by columns. So I can go in and change the names of them to make them actually different if I don't need that. But okay. Great. So let's see, what else do we need to know about arrays? What are some good things to know about arrays? Let me find my quick, there's something else I think I was missing here. Feel free to jump in if you remember something else here, Miles or others, but let's see, we got names. Yeah, we got accessing individual elements of an array. Yeah, adding elements of an array. So overriding or adding in additional ones. Using the push method, there we go. Oh yeah, length. Perfect. So another really important thing to be able to have access to is to know how long your array is. And this is going to become really important and really obvious in just a moment when we start shifting over and using for loops. Because you'll often want to do something where you iterate through an array, which means you sort of go successively through each indexed element in your array and do something based on each of those. So a simple one might be that you want to print out each of those and display them line by line, but there might be lots of other things that you want to do. So this is a good example of that difference between a dot having a function and a dot having a property. So there is a property of an array that is called length, and that is the number of elements that exist in that array. So let me do that on, I'll go back up here to our names, and I'm going to say names, well, I'm going to document.write, document.write names.length. And theoretically, yep, it's working, good. I should have just like a quick key saved for the line break that I can just copy paste. Well, I could just copy paste it. So there we go. Up top, it is now, it wrote the number 8. So let's see how it got 8. So names.length, you see there's no parentheses, open, close parentheses here, other than the parentheses that are being used for the document.write. So if I wanted to be even clearer about that, I could say var length gets names.length, and then type in here length or size. I'm going to do it size. So functionally, it's going to work the same. Yep. But we can see that this names.length does not have parentheses after it. It's just a property of the array rather than a function, rather than something that the function's doing, you're doing to the function, it's just getting some info back. So it goes into the array and counts. So we had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. That's how it got 8. And this is the one thing that's often going to be maybe trip you up. So length starts counting from 1, whereas the index starts counting from 0. So if you had a length down here, let's check our length of this colors actually. Document.write colors.length. And where is that even going to come up? Aha, there we go. So for our colors array here, when I access the length property, we see that colors doesn't have anything in it yet. So it has a length of 0. So I shouldn't say that the counting starts from 1. It only starts from 1 if you have one element. But if you don't have anything in there, it's going to give you a value of 0. So here we can see it has 0. Then we start adding these things in through the push method. And then I could do, again, in here, I could say document.write colors.length. And now it says it's initially 0, and then it became 4, and then it once it had all those things pushed into it, and then it displayed it. Okay, so that length is a really useful property just to know how many things are in there. Imagine like you're having some sort of a random generator that created obstacles for a character, and it did that every so often based on a timer. So it wasn't like the player was doing something or clicking something to create it, but just on some timer, these obstacles were being created. And at some point in the code, you needed to know, okay, like how many obstacles are there, or how many coins are there that need to be collected. And you could have a tally that keeps getting incremented each time. And each time it gets incremented, it is what it's doing. Then you check the length of the array, and then you update your little sheet that says coins equals 10. So you know how many targets there are to get, that kind of thing. So make some sense? Hopefully. Let's see, check in on arrays questions here before moving forward. Length is something that JavaScript knows. So an array has a series of properties already. Let's actually take a look at that for a second. I'm going to go over to Google and say JS array. That's my key search term for anything here. Just put in JS as a shortcut for JavaScript. And then I typically go to the W3 schools, though some of the other ones are perfectly good as well. JavaScript arrays, and gives you example, tells you what it is, how to create an array. All this stuff is stuff that we've seen. And then let's see, accessing elements using the index, we saw that. And then changing elements, we saw that. So overwriting the sob with an opal here. Accessing the full array. Let me get down to where properties, here we go. Properties and methods. So we have the length property. So just as we did, it's a predefined thing about the array. That's a good way to do that. Looping array elements. Sorry, I'm just checking through here to see where are these other properties and methods. So sorry for the scroll. Yeah, go ahead.
So we've seen you divide it into words and numbers. Is it possible to combine those within the same array?
Yes.
And not have anything go. Okay.
Yep. Yeah, you could definitely have something that combines both in the same array. The array doesn't care, but your code later might care. So it depends on how you're going to be treating those things. So you can certainly have a combined array that's just var new array, whatever you want it to be. And I'm going to call it, I'm going to put in here name, a number. I'm going to put in another name. I'm going to put in, I'm going to be crazy here, going to put in another array of numbers. And lastly, a name. Okay, there we go. So I've got now an array here that's called new array. And if we want to look at something from it, let me clear this up for a second. And let's document.write new array element 0. And where'd everything go? There we go. Okay, so now the last line here is name currently. If I tell it to go to display element 1, we go 0, 1, it gives us the number 45. I'm going to do 2, 3. I'm going to put in 3 to see what happens there. it pops out our list of 1, 2, 3, because that whole thing is one element in the array. And then the last one would be element 4. So the array doesn't care. But yeah, go ahead.
Wouldn't Bob be number 3 and the new array number 4?
Yeah, good question. That's the trick where your index starts from 0. So new array index 0, you can see here returns name once it updates here. There it goes. So this is index 0. This is index 1. This is index 2, 3, 4. So that's
Okay, I just skipped a number.
Yeah. Well, it's all, you just start from 0 when you're counting your indices. So even if the length is 5, that means it's 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 are the indices that you have. Yeah, good. Another thing that I noticed just as I was doing that scroll, that JavaScript arrays thing on the W3 schools is good, but it's pretty exhaustive. It's got a lot of things in there. So I was scrolling through a whole bunch of things. One thing that popped up that is useful, or another thing that's useful, I think there is sometimes if you want to find the last element in an array and you're not keeping track of, you're not like pushing them in on your own one at a time and keeping track of what the last element is, you can access that by using the length function or the length attribute. So if I say here, for this example, I'm going to put in new array and I want to get the last element. I'm going to say new array, new, and the index is going to be new array dot length. And then I'm going to let that go for a second. And we can see it's giving me an undefined. So let's think about that for a second, what's happening here. So this is a bit nested also in here, but the key thing is we have an array and we're accessing an index, and the index we're going to get is really just a number. We need a number to tell it which index to use. And new array.length is a number. It goes and sees how long is that array, and it says it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 elements long. So it's saying this number is equivalent to 5. And then it's going to say, get the element at index 5 of new array. Okay, so it goes in and says 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 is undefined. So that's why it's returning undefined. So very commonly, if you want to do this kind of a trick to get the last element of an array, you say array.length minus 1 is going to be the index of the last element. And that's just that confusing difference between an index and a length, that they're going to be off by 1. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 is 5 elements. Cool. So that's a useful thing, accessing last element in array. Cool. Other questions about arrays? Or are we ready to move on to the next grand thing? Let's move on. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. Is
Please.
there a way to return the numerical value of that last thing? Like if you just wanted to know how many elements you had in the array
Yes.
instead of what the last one is?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And that's what we were doing up here when we print these numbers. So if we look at colors, so document.write colors.length, for example, right there, that is returning the number. At this point, it's returning 0 because it had no elements in it at first. Then we pushed in 4 elements, and then we returned 4 at this point. So colors.length was 4, and we printed that to the document. If you wanted to have access to it in code other than displaying it, you could just say var num of colors gets colors dot length. So that's the same thing, but now it's assigning that number to the variable number of colors. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Nice, great. Okay, so let's move forward. We'll still be touching on arrays as we go forward, so feel free to shout out if questions come up as we go there. So the next thing I want to do is going to be looking at for loops. And for loops are a way of doing something many times, or just a couple, but to do something more than once. And so let me just, I'm going to comment out all this at the moment. Great, so we'll start from scratch. So for loops is a way to do something over and over again. And it's the way that you write it is using like for a given condition, do certain, do the code over and over again. So it'll become a little more clear in a second. For, and there's two different schools of thought on here, but I'll just do the most, like the most, I don't know, some version. I'm going to do a version here. Basically, some people have the I, or leave this var in here. Some people take it out. But I'll do it like this for now. So I'm just going to write it out until I is less than 10, I plus plus. And we're going to just do this many times. Okay, so this is the very basic structure of a for loop. And what it does is it, like the if-then statements, there's sort of a condition that it's checking to see if it should keep doing this code or not, or if it should execute it. So in here, this condition is really a counter. And you start with a value. Usually I is what's most commonly used. It's like I is thought of as the increment, the thing that's going to be counted. Starting at 0, so we have an initial state, I is equal to 0. And then until, or so long as this is true, which is I is less than 10. So it's saying we will do this as long as I is equal to, or I is less than 10. And at the end of each time, you're going to increment by 1. So remember we saw that I plus plus last week, which takes, if I is 0 and you do I plus plus, you get 1. Now if it's 1, I plus plus, it's 2, I plus plus, it's 3, etc. So we're going to go in here and starting at 0, we're going to do this code once, then we're going to add 1 to I, then we're going to check, is I still less than 10? If so, do the code again, and then add 1 to I, etc. over and over until you get to, let's say we get to 9, up to 9. Now I is 9. We go I is less than 10, so 9 is less than 10, that's true. We do the code one more time. We add 1 to it, and then this is no longer true, and then you exit out. So let's just test this and see. So document.write, hello space. Okay, so I now just wrote in my code, hello. And how many times did I write hello? And you can count them, or we can look at the code, either way. It's going to be this number, the number that, in this case, this less than 10, it's going to be 10. And that's because, again, counting from 0, we go 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Yeah, Miles has got it. We end up with 10 times that we iterate through this for loop function. So great, I just did it all. Yeah.
I was just going to kick in one of the ways that helps me remember it is that when computers count, since computers count from 0, you've got 9 fingers. Because if you count from 0, you go 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So it's kind of a weird way to help you remember that counting from 0 is a little strange.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. So these these for loops can do any number of things. Anything that you want to happen more than a couple of times, it might be worth considering putting it in a for loop. Let's see. So basic things that we might want to do additionally. Let's actually go ahead and start connecting this in with an array that we were doing before. So I'm going to put in an array. Define it. My array gets, and it's going to get. Let's just do some. Because it's quick, I'm just going to do some random numbers, or not necessarily random, but numbers without meaning. Okay, I'm going to do that many of them. So I don't know how many there are. Let me put this part up here. So I keep that, and I'm going to make a new version down here. This. So bear with me for 1 second so I clean up. Okay, so now I've defined an array here called my array, and I want to just print out all the elements of my array. But let's say I don't know how many elements there are, or maybe there's too many that I don't want to count them. I don't know how many there are. I can count this, but let's just imagine that. So this is going to be a very common thing that you're going to do with an array. So in combination with a for loop, starting at 0, we're going to go up to the total length of the array. So how can we find the length of the array? That's something we already did. What's the length of the array? Anyone want to chime in? Miles got it? Someone else? How do you find the length of an array?
Hint, it's a property.
It is a property.
A predefined property.
We did it up here.
Array length.
Yeah. Nice. Yep, the array dot length. And so in this case, the array we're looking at is called my array, just because that's what I named it. My array dot length. In this case, you don't need to do the -1 because you say, let's count just so we see what's happening here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So there are 7 elements in my array. So my array dot length is going to return the value of 7. Is going to be here. And then so we want it to be I is less than 7. So it's going to go 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and stop, which gives us 7 times through. So great, it did it. So now we know that the code that's going to happen in here is going to happen once for each element in the array. So what do we want to do in here? Let's print out the numbers. Document.write. Ooh, okay. How are we going to print out each of those numbers so that it's different? Let me just try something. Let me just say my array, and then I have to give an index, and I'm going to put in the index of 0, and then I'm going to put in a line break. Okay. Come back.
Sometimes I think the line break thing freaks it out in
Does
Code
it?
Pen. I've
Oh,
noticed.
yeah.
Yeah, I've just noticed it tends to get a little weird and then it comes back at some point.
Okay.
So,
Yeah, well, let's see if I can.
let's try saving it
Check.
and then reloading
Yeah.
it.
Yeah, good call. At 100 plus unsaved changes. Okay, there we go.
Yeah. It just seems to flip it out sometimes.
Yeah. Okay, great. So there we go. We got, it printed something 7 times, which is good, but it printed just the same one over and over again. which, you could kind of hope that I would I put in 0, so maybe the next time through it will automatically go up. But it's not going to do that unless we tell it to do that somehow on its own. And there's a nice way, a convenient sort of shortcut using a for loop, which is to use this variable I. So this variable I is going to be a local variable. So remember local versus global, when we talked about having functions and you could define like a variable within that, and that variable might just be available to that function, not available to the rest of the code, versus a global thing, which is right now like this my array is defined at that global scope. So it's defined at a level so that anywhere in my code can access my array. So this I is something that is really just a local variable to this for loop. So I could have, but everything in this for loop knows that I. So if I just magically come in and put I instead of 0, hopefully it'll update quickly. It did. Great. It's doing exactly what I want it to now. Because every time that increment number steps up by 1, it is going to step up the index. So I starts at 0. So the first time through here, this is 0, and it returns our 32. Now that gets I++, so that becomes 1. 1, it gives us 34. 2, it gives us 15. 3, 4, 5, 6. So that incremental variable is a really great thing to be able to do some powerful things based on how many times you're going to be stepping through that for loop.
Yeah, this is going to be something you're going to do over and over again once we start making our games, because just like David's saying, it's like you've got 5 panda bears that are chasing you around, and you like hit the panda bear power up or something, and it's going to be like, okay, go through however many panda bears are out there, walk through each one and turn them red or pink or something, and that's the way you would do that, is that you've got an array that contains all of your panda bears, and then you set up a for loop that says go through each panda bear and do this thing to it. So this structure, it takes a while to get used to it because it's actually fairly detailed, but this is kind of almost the whole deal. Like Rad was saying on the comments, he's like, this is what I spent all my time doing. It's setting up arrays and then going through them with for loops to do things to them. So this is kind of the meat of it.
Yeah.
And it takes a while to get it.
Okay, I was going to say one of the most powerful things that I think that I do with arrays is using a for loop to go through an array and do a conditional check to like make sure like certain things are happening to certain ones. So like specifically in this example, we could go through this and do like an if function, and if my array dot I is greater than 50, then we write it down, and then we don't write it if it's not 50.
Nice. Yep.
Yeah, that's right.
I is greater than 50. Then document. And let's take that too. Yeah, cool. So it just playing out what Rad had said here. So back to our conditionals. So if the statement in here is true, then you'll execute these 2 lines of code. And the thing we're checking if it's true is my array I. So that's going to be the index of I, just like we did down here. And so when you do that, it goes to my array, substitutes whatever number the for loop is on for the index, and it comes up here and will return that number as a value. So first it's going to return 32 here, and it says if 32 is greater than 50, which is not true, so it's not going to do this. If 34, etc., and then it gets just those 2, 76 and 100. So notice here we had that one that was 50, it didn't get returned. And if you wanted that to be returned as well, you'd have to do greater than or equal to. And then now, theoretically, 50 should add into the mix there. Yeah, good. Yeah, and you can do all sorts of things in that kind of way like that. Another thing that I tend to do with these for loops is like object generation. So you might have something like, I'm going to generate 100. I want to generate 100 of these characters, and each time it goes through, it might determine the properties of that particular character, and then sort of assign it to a character, and then now it's available to me, and then push it into an array. So that way, sort of alternately, you can use it, like Rad was saying, to step through your array and do something based on the conditions, or you could use it to generate something and then push it into an array to make a longer list of things. So just depending on where you're working in your code. Nice. Okay, great. So I think that the next thing that I want to do is just a quick, just sort of demo, and I'm going to do this in a pretty fast fashion, just because we've talked about it a number of times today already. But you're not going to be asked to do anything related to this yet, which is to be thinking about objects, just so you kind of see that they're there and see how they might be useful in the near future of things. So objects are, if you think of sort of like all the data types we've been thinking about, we've had numbers, we've had strings, now we have arrays as a data type. And really sort of an object is kind of a data type, that's like one package of a bunch of other information, in the way that an array is kind of like a package of some smaller things. But it's held together in a way that where you can define properties and access them later using the named sort of like keyword of that property. So this came up early on in our in the discussions today, and now we can kind of see it in action here a bit. So for example, if I wanted to create, I like pandas, so let's go with Miles's panda, and we want to create a panda as an object. We do these with curly braces for defining an object in JavaScript. So it differentiates it a bit right there from an array. And then we need to go in and give it a series of pairs, usually, of a name and a value pair. And I'm actually blanking for a second. Does someone else, I can look it up quickly, as to whether the names have quotations on them?
They don't have to.
They don't have to?
So you can write, it's probably easier without, but you can do it either way. They're both are legal.
Okay. So you can say things like name, and we give it a value of this panda's name is going to be, Miles, you give us a panda name.
Sunset.
Nice. And then
I got this all worked out.
And then the panda's size is
medium.
I'm probably going to do this lowercase because that would be useful. Okay, the pandas. Here's going to be a trickier one. The panda's friends is going to be, and let's make this an array.
Oh yeah.
So let's give us three of panda's friends.
Strawberry.
Shifu?
What was the next one?
Shifu.
Correct my spelling if I'm incorrect.
And there's Bob in the comments.
There's Bob. Okay, Bob's a good friend too. And then of course we have to have enemies. Who are the panda's enemies? Is it
man?
I think that's it, right? Okay, so we've created an object here. All this could be on one line. you know, these, I sort of separated out with returns to put these things on separate lines, but as long as you have the commas there, you're creating an object. And so now now all of these things are properties. So you can start creating these things that feel a little bit more like, ooh, this is cool. I can understand why I would do this, or how I'd use it in creating something. And you can access things now also. So I could say like document.write panda.name. And hey, it wrote sunset. Document.write panda size and medium, or you know, friends. And it's going to write out here that array of all of Panda's friends. So you can start doing cool things there, like imagining the situation where you are doing something and you have or in the game, if panda.size equals medium. So that's something I don't think we've actually done yet, is with conditionals using strings, but it works just the same as long as the string that's returned on one side matches the other. It can work. You can't do greater than or less than with strings. Then document, right. Okay, great. So if the panda size is only a mere medium, then it comes in here and does this line. So if I had said if, well, actually, let me just do it else, because here's a refresher. Else, if, that's one we haven't done before, else if, but it works as you probably can imagine. Else if size gets large, then do whatever's in here. Like that. So this would give you a couple different conditions that you could follow based on that. So if I come in and change now the size of the panda, it should change the size, change the feedback that comes in. Stop feeding him. Cool. So I don't know. I don't know if, Miles, should we go into like using constructors now with that, or just leave that be as sort of that objects are a thing? Like
That might be enough. I think, yeah, constructors might be
yeah. So
we can cover that later.
Yeah. So all I will say is that you can create these objects then like this, sort of like an individual object, but then you can also create kind of like a class of things. And in this case, you could call it an object constructor, which is you could create something that has a series of properties, and then you could say that I want to create a new panda and give it a series of properties. You know, like say my new panda is going to have a different name, different size, different friends, all of that. And you can do that with having the structure of a panda already set. So later on in your game, you can say, give me a new panda. It's going to have these properties, and then you know that it's going to be able to be parsed and read by the rest of the code if you've set it up to know what to do with the panda. So yeah,
and it's interesting. I think this structure, the object literal structure here that we're demoing, everything in JavaScript is kind of based on this structure. So like that's the way when we do, math.random or an array dot length, all those things are defined in this way. So you would see something very akin to this if you were to go into the JavaScript, code and definition. So
yeah,
this is actually pretty cool.
And just one quick extension of that, because thinking like math.random is a method. So, it's a function that does something. You can create objects in here that have functions associated with them, as we call them, methods associated with it. So for example, I could come in and say, I'm going to call mine eat bamboo, and I'm going to define this as a function that does something. Let's see if I can make it work here. This is something I haven't done much of, so you, catch me if I'm wrong. Is that going to do it?
Try it.
Let's try it. So let's just what I could do now that I created a line here that this function eat bamboo that's listed just like a regular sort of property of the object. So panda dot eat bamboo, and then I call it with my function there, with my parentheses. Yeah, it worked. Awesome.
Yeah.
So now, if I
So David just wrote a method.
Whoa. Follow David's method.
Yeah.
So every time now I call that method, it's going to execute whatever was associated with that. So it did that yum yum 3 times.
So this is cool. I mean, I think as the more we think about this, you'll see that in a way, I don't know, you might be able, I don't actually know if you could do it in an array with a function. You might be able to actually, but you could write this panda object in using an array. You know what I mean? Like you can, like an arrays and objects can basically do the same thing. You know, you're just listing things, but you're accessing them. Like someone brought this up in the chat. You're accessing them in the array. You have to access it by the index, which is the number, and in an object you access it by the name, by the property name.
Yeah. An array, you need the name and the index.
Yes.
And so if
the name of the array index.
Yeah, and so if I did that down here, I just started. If I created this panda as an array down here, it might look like this, and it could contain all that same information. Yeah, I'm not 100% sure on the functions. It may or may not.
I think it might work actually.
Yeah,
I bet it works.
Yeah, probably.
But let's not test it.
But the different situation here is that now you have to remember that whenever you want to get the size of this panda, you have to remember that is going to be index 1. Panda as array index 1 would return large, which is fine as long as you remember that or write that into your code somehow that it's going to remember that. But that's the kind of
Would
thing
you guys say that I was going to say, would you generally we would probably use the array for things where we don't really care that much about which one, particularly, like we might have an array to hold like all the enemies. Like if we've got like 80 Space Invaders coming down the screen, we don't need to access them by, though the Space Invader's name is Jerry and this Space Invader's name is Suzette or something like that. We don't need to access it that way. We're just like, it's the next Space Invader in the line that we need to check whether or not it's exploded or not.
Yeah.
But with an object, it's something like, oh, I'm setting up an object like a character, or you might use an object to create a Space Invader, which has all of its properties like type and all that kind of thing, and then stick that object into an array.
Yeah.
So that would be the last kind of meta thing, is that you can put objects into arrays. And like Rad was saying, this is kind of what we do. This is the whole engine almost of everything we're going to be doing, is like having these different data types that we're kind of moving around and having talk to each other.
Yeah, and typically the way that I think of that is that I use arrays to hold similar things. I have an array of numbers. I have an array of names, array of colors, array of enemies. But especially like that last example, that array of enemies or array of characters, whatever, it's likely that each of those elements is going to be a complex thing. It's going to be an object.
Yeah.
but really, to me, that's the way I sort of think of it. Array, you keep a list of similar things of whatever level of complexity.
That's cool.
Yeah. Nice.
I like
well, I think that's probably plenty of code for today.
Yeah, that's
so, but again,
a good
remember
chunk.
the key things really are that that for loop. So being able to step through something in a iterative fashion a number of times to do that code over and over again, and then also arrays, which we've talked about in lots of different ways. So ordered lists that you can access based on an index, and then combining those gets you more and more flexibility and sort of power to access a lot of information quickly. And again, a lot of these things are really pretty, we're using arrays of 5 or 6 elements, stuff like that, but oftentimes it's really not unheard of to get into situations when you have an array that might have 1,000 elements in it, and it's just becomes so obvious that you're not going to want to have to do anything with that like by hand. You just want the code to just go through all of those and do everything in a structured way to those all those elements in that array.
David, would you mind jumping back to the W3 schools thing? Because I think Rad mentioned this in the chat as well, and David pointed this out. I think this is such a good resource because you can they have the try it yourself function there. So you can jump right in and see how it works practically. And then you can then try it yourself. You can go in and try to see if your understanding actually matches the way it works. And so I think we all use this all the time. So the classic thing, I was just forgetting, like, okay, someone asked about how to take something out of an array, which is the splice method of an array.
Oh, yep.
And I always forget what are the parameters, because you go my array dot splice parentheses, and then what goes in the parentheses. I always forget the order because you have to supply, well, which index do you want to splice it? How many things do you want to add or take out? And I always go back to here and I'm like, oh, okay, what was that? And then I try it out and make sure I know what I'm doing.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. So like that's
if you make you make a mistake in a complicated thing and it really screws you up. So it's nice to jump out of your particular code, which is really complicated, into something really simple, which is in the W3 schools is the try it yourself thing.
Yeah. Cool. And so, and just a note in here, this is something that we're going to start moving towards next week. So you might start getting used to seeing this a bit. So this is code which is done in a way where all of the code is done in a single file. So like a single tab, instead of on our code pen, we had these 3 HTML, CSS, and JS tabs that were kind of kept separately for us. In here, these things are all combined into one, and you'll see that the JavaScript stuff is just nested within these tags, these called script tags. In all of this other stuff is HTML code, which we haven't really talked about at this point. But you'll just notice that anything that's inside of here looks just like regular JavaScript that we've been seeing. So to do the stuff that's going on in here and to edit it, you can tweak things in here and run it, try it, see what happens, and it updates over here. Yeah. Good. So that's just a quick heads up that we will sort of starting next week start moving to a situation where we're not going to be relying on CodePen as much. But we'll start building these game projects in an environment where you'll be creating a text file that is going to hold the code in a way similar to this. Then you'll execute that directly into the browser and use the browser's built-in debugging functions, which are actually a bit more robust than CodePens. So you'll get better feedback. And then lastly, showing you the system to take all that code that you wrote and then push it up so it lives on a web address rather than living on your local computer, because all students have access to some web space through webpages.sou.edu.
And then are we just going to share the link with you for homework assignments?
Mostly, yeah. unless it's maybe more complex. But most of the times you'll share the link, and yeah, we can access the code source that way. Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Thanks.
Yeah. Cool. Well, is there anything else that you want to try and cover today, Miles, or just want to leave it there and hang around for some questions?
I'd be happy to hang out and like we can work through some of this stuff. I think people might still have questions from last week's homework, random numbers and all that. I've been putting together this extensive kind of document about covering all the stuff from last week. It's a little late. Check it out. It should answer a lot of this because there's a lot of detail in this. Since it's new to most of you, it takes a while to understand it. So it's great to work through stuff with you guys and answer these questions.
Yeah, great. Nice.
So yeah, if you want to hang out and ask questions or we can work through it, that's fine. If you want to take off, I think we're ready to, we can let you go then. Otherwise, I think, right?
Yeah, I think so. The key things are just remember to there's code basics assignments for this week, but that's it. I think there's just, and there's just 4 of those. And then be ready. Next week, we'll be starting to think more about pivoting towards really like game development stuff. So feel free, there's no requirement on it, but if you wanted to start like sketching out ideas for games that you might want to think about making, that kind of top down, go through that game design forum that you guys submitted to. That's some really cool examples as a good place to start. So you might want to start with that and start sketching out what types of ideas you want to do. Just pencil and paper is great. And then we'll start working on moving those assets into a digital format and starting to see how to connect them to the code that we've been doing. So yeah, awesome. Thanks, guys. We'll hang out.
Thanks.
Thank you. And I'll stop the recording because